Welcome back to Track Live. Today we're going to be installing some KW coilovers on GTChannel's Project S2000. So once we remove the wheel, we're just going to remove the 117mm bolt that's holding the shock to the lower A-arm. In order to access the two 14mm bolt on top of the shock, we have to remove the interior panel. And most of the time the interior panel is just held on by some clips. Unfortunately, this one doesn't have any. Or fortunately for me, this one doesn't have any. The two 14mm bolts are underneath this filler pipe. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna remove the three 8mm nut that's attached to this filler pipe, and then we can move the filler pipe out of the way. And this 110 also. There you go. With the filler pipe out of the way, we could access the two 14mm nut on top of the shock. Now we can remove the shock. That's it. As you can tell with the two shocks side by side, the KW shock is definitely much more compact. It uses a smaller diameter spring, and also it uses a helper spring compared to the single spring design of the factory. As you can see, there's still external reservoirs on both of them, but the KW shock is actually a threaded body, so that way you can actually raise and lower the vehicle by moving the perch of the shock. And then also, as you can see, the KW shock comes with a brand new pillow ball mount compared to the factory, which is actually rubber, and there's a lot less deflection. Obviously, there was no deflection with the KW top mount versus the factory top mount, which obviously has a lot of compliance in it. Another aspect of the KW shock, obviously, is the fact that you can adjust compression and rebound on the shock, and this will change the characteristics of the shock, especially at the track where you can actually adjust for more compression or rebound depending on the driver preference or also the modifications on the vehicle. For instance, on a vehicle that has a wing, you're probably going to use less rebound because of the fact that the wings are actually going to keep the vehicle more firmly planted. So what we're going to do now is we're going to be installing the new KW shock back into the vehicle, and obviously there's just a reverse order of the removal. Just going to slide it into this slot. And then we're going to put the two nuts and bolts on the top, or two nuts and two washers on top. Okay. I'm going to tighten the bottom bolt. So we'll be torquing the top shock bolts to 36 foot-pounds. With the shock bolts tight now, we're going to put the filler neck back into its place. Like the rear, we're going to remove the wheel first so we can get access to all the suspension bolts. Compared to the rear, the front requires a few more extra bolts to be removed. First thing you need to do is remove the two 10mm bolts that's holding the ABS line to the upper A-arm, the two 17mm bolts holding the upper A-arm to the chassis, one 12mm bolt holding the brake line to the shock, and one 17mm bolt holding the shock to the lower A-arm. Besides that, you need to remove the two 14mm bolt holding the shock to the upper shock tower. We're going to be removing the ABS line 10mm bolts off first. The 12mm brake line held onto the shock. 17mm bolts onto the upper A-arm. The upper A-arm bolts were already loose, but we just left it in there just so the upper A-arm stays in place. But now we're going to actually fully remove it. Just pull it out, hold it to the side. And now the shock can actually come out. And there you go. Here's the front shock comparison. As you can see, the main difference is the external reservoir that's on the KW shock, unlike the factory shock. And the fact that on the factory shock, you notice that there's a nut welded onto the brake line, or the brake line. The KW one does not have one, so you have to supply your own M6 nut that you can find from any local hardware store or Home Depot or Lowe's. So that's one thing that does not come with it. They do come with a threaded nut for that, but not for the actual brake line. Other than that, it's pretty much similar to the rear design. It comes with a pillow ball hat, so similar to the front, and it also comes with the two new nuts and 2 washers for the top. So don't use the factory nut for the KW. We're going to be reinstalling the KW shock back into the shock tower. So we're just going to slide it up in there, and then to keep it in place, we're going to put 2 of the KW washers and nuts in place just to hold it there. We don't need to tighten it down yet, but just so the shock doesn't fall out when I'm working on the bottom. So we just reinstalled the bolt on the lower A-arm, and then with the KW nut, we're gonna put it back on. We're gonna put the upper A-arm back into place, just temporarily. Well, we're not gonna tighten the bolt down, but we're gonna put the bolt in place. Just hand tighten them. Put the ABS line back on. Okay, that's good. So we're going to be torquing all the 17mm bolts down. And these are to the manufacturer settings. Now we're going to tighten the 2 17mm nut on top, and then we're going to torque them down and put the wheels on, and then we're finished with the coilover install.